Most of us imagine the world of Jesus as a simple, peaceful time, a world of shepherds, scrolls, and prayers. But beneath the serene stories lies a web of commerce, taxation, and financial power struggles that would shock even the most seasoned historians. Did you know that the economic system in Jesus' time could dictate life or death for the average person? That your access to food, water, and safety wasn't just about God's favor but about taxes, trade, and the invisible hands of empire. Today, we're going to uncover how money and trade really worked in the era of Jesus, and as you'll see, the echoes of this ancient economy are still felt in ways you won't expect. How money and trade really worked in the era of Jesus. To understand the economy of Jesus' time, we need to travel to the 1st century CIA world under the shadow of the Roman Empire. Rome wasn't just a conqueror of lands, it was a conqueror of systems. They didn't merely impose military rule, they imposed economic rule. Taxes were collected relentlessly, trade networks were monopolized, and currency was standardized. In Judea, where Jesus lived, people didn't pay taxes in vague terms, they paid in Roman coins, often denarius coins stamped with the image of Caesar himself. Using these coins was more than a financial transaction, it was a political statement, and that created tension. Imagine being required to use money bearing the image of the empire occupying your land, and then being taxed on top of it. At the same time, local money changers and merchants thrived. They exchanged Roman currency for temple currency, collected tolls, and acted as the invisible cogs of an economy that determined who could eat, who could trade, and who could survive. But here's the twist most people miss. This economy wasn't static. It was fragile, exploitative, and prone to crisis, much like our modern financial systems. The roots of Jesus' economy trace back centuries. The Jewish people had a long history of local markets, trade routes, and agricultural taxes. But after centuries of foreign dominion, Persian, Greek, and now Roman, the economy was a patchwork of old traditions and imperial impositions. The temple in Jerusalem wasn't just a religious center, it was the hub of economic life. Pilgrims traveling from hundreds of miles away had to buy temple currency to pay tithes and offerings. Merchants sold animals at inflated prices, and money changers facilitated the transactions, sometimes taking a hefty commission. This meant that ordinary people were caught in a cycle of dependency. They had to earn money to trade, pay taxes to survive, and buy religious offerings to maintain their social and spiritual standing. And yet, despite the complexity, markets thrived. Trade routes connected Judea to Egypt, Syria, and beyond. Olive oil, wine, wheat, and textiles moved across the Mediterranean, enriching a few while leaving the majority struggling to make ends meet. During Jesus' lifetime, trade reached levels unseen in earlier centuries. Cities like Capernaum and Jerusalem became economic hubs. Merchants, traders, and tax collectors were everywhere, sometimes operating openly, sometimes exploiting loopholes in the system. Roman roads allowed goods to move faster than ever before. Olive oil from Galilee could be sold in Rome. Fine cloth from Damascus could reach Jerusalem markets. Credit systems existed, informal loans were made, and even interest rates were regulated in complex ways. Yet, the growth wasn't evenly distributed. A small class of wealthy merchants and priests controlled large portions of trade and money. Meanwhile, peasants and artisans lived hand-to-mouth, vulnerable to crop failures, price manipulation, and Roman taxation. Here's an astonishing fact. In Jerusalem alone, during festival times, hundreds of thousands of pilgrims arrived. The sudden influx of people created temporary economic booms. Prices for food and lodging skyrocketed. For the rich, this was opportunity. For the poor, it was a nightmare. But no economy is without its cracks. The combination of heavy taxation, exploitative trade practices, and inequality created constant tension. One of the most infamous examples comes directly from the New Testament: the cleansing of the temple. Jesus overturned the tables of the money changers, calling out the corruption that had turned a sacred space into a marketplace. Why was this so explosive? Because these money changers weren't criminals, they were necessary intermediaries in the economic system. Temple authorities, Roman officials, and merchants all benefited from the status quo. Economic pressure points were everywhere. Farmers who couldn't pay taxes faced losing their land. Artisans dependent on trade struggled when Roman demand fluctuated. Pilgrims were forced into unfavorable exchange rates to participate in religious rituals. In short, while trade and currency allowed the economy to flourish in some areas, it created systemic inequality and social unrest, a breaking point that would later manifest in revolts, including the Jewish revolts against Rome. The fallout from this economic structure was immense. The poor remained trapped in cycles of debt, the wealthy consolidated more power, and the temple, once the spiritual heart of Judea, became a symbol of economic oppression. Even daily life was dictated by money. What you could eat, how you could travel, and even whom you could marry depended on your access to resources. And here's the deeper lesson. Economic exploitation wasn't just a personal hardship, it was a social and political weapon. The Roman Empire used economic control to maintain dominance. By dictating taxes, trade, and currency, Rome could suppress dissent without firing a single arrow. Attempts to fix the system existed, but few succeeded. Jewish leaders tried reforms, but these often benefited the elite more than the masses. Jesus himself highlighted the need for moral and economic reform, not just spiritual change. His critiques of moneylenders, corrupt merchants, and oppressive taxation weren't abstract, they were responses to a failing economic system. Other attempts like localized debt forgiveness or redistribution during festivals offered temporary relief but didn't address the systemic issues. Sound familiar? These are lessons repeated in every economic crisis across history. Temporary fixes without structural change fail to stop inequality, exploitation, and social unrest. Now, here's where it gets fascinating and alarming. The economic patterns from Jesus' time aren't just history. They echo in modern societies: wealth concentration in a small elite, exploitative tax systems, dependence of the poor on unstable markets, temporary economic booms that benefit few. Consider this. In 2025, the top 1% control nearly 45% of global wealth. Sound familiar? Just like in ancient Judea, a few hold most of the economic power while the majority struggled to survive. Even our modern monetary systems rely on intermediaries, banks, credit systems, and financial instruments that most people don't fully understand. Much like the money changers of Jerusalem, these intermediaries can dictate access to opportunity, creating systemic inequality. Visuals: side-by-side comparisons. Roman coins versus modern dollar bills. Ancient marketplaces versus modern stock exchanges. Takeaways. So, what can we learn from the economy of Jesus' time? 1. Economic systems shape society. Money isn't neutral. Who controls currency, trade, and taxation influences social power, access to resources, and even political stability. 2. Inequality has deep roots. History shows us that unequal access to trade and wealth isn't a modern problem, it's ancient, persistent, and dangerous if left unchecked. 3. Temporary fixes rarely solve systemic problems. Debt forgiveness, short-term subsidies, or moral critiques are valuable, but they won't fix an exploitative economic system unless structural reform occurs. And perhaps the most sobering thought: the economic lessons of 2,000 years ago still apply today. We may think we've evolved, but the patterns of power, wealth, and exploitation continue to shape our world. Next time you read a parable, remember Jesus wasn't just teaching morality, he was speaking to people living under an economic system that dictated almost every aspect of their lives. Understanding these patterns doesn't just illuminate history, it warns us about the cycles we repeat, even in our modern economies. If you found this exploration of money, trade, and power fascinating, hit that like button, subscribe for more deep dives into history, and share your thoughts in the comments. Which lesson from Jesus' time do you think applies most to our world today? History isn't just the past, it's the mirror in which we can see the present, and sometimes that reflection is uncomfortable, but necessary.